J.R.R. Tolkien started and abandoned very quickly a sequel to Lord of the Rings called The New Shadow. This is fairly well known. The text is included in volume 12 of History of Middle-earth, The People's Middle-earth, which is the last volume of this big textual history behind all the stuff he wrote about Middle-earth. And The New Shadow is set in the Fourth Age. It's set just after, not just after, 100 years or maybe 200 years. There are different dates in different places after the Lord of the Rings, and the theme is what he calls humanity's men's quick satiety with good. The fact that we very quickly become bored with things that are good and we turn back to evil. And he says there'll be boys playing at being orcs and smashing stuff, and looking back to the past, the old days of darkness with sort of the chilled delight that we often look at horror and things. And I guess the question, I don't have too much to say, but it's something really spurred me to, when I read it a few weeks ago, would it have been good if he'd continued it? And it seems like a ridiculous question because he only wrote 6 pages in this version, plus an extra paragraph, so just over 6.5 pages of it in this kind of formatted book. Not much. He wrote it. It was written initially in the 50s. One version was typed on a typewriter that he used in the 50s, and so it may well have happened. A big thing about Tolkien's writing is that his writing of new, really functional new stuff that isn't linguistic and technical, sometimes fascinating, but much more corners of the world, stops in the 50s. For the last 20 or maybe less, no, the last 15 years of his life, he mostly niggled around trying to work out how does this bit work and what's the logic behind this, and that was he felt it would help him work out some of the deeper problems he saw with the Silmarillion particularly. But he didn't write anything beyond his partial rewrite of the Silmarillion in the 50s after Lord of the Rings, and he did a couple of starts to novels. I'll talk about the other one another time, Tal Elmar, but which may be even more interesting than The New Shadow. But The New Shadow, he quickly abandoned, and he made a couple of comments. In 1964, he wrote that he found that, thinking about it, there were all these, eventually people would become just people again. The Age of Heroes was over, and there'd be an outcrop of revolutionary plots, centre of secret satanistic religion. I could have written a thriller about the plot and its discovery and overthrow, but it would be just that, not worth doing. And again, 1972, 15 months before he dies, he says to Douglas Carter, his friend, that would have little interest after the overthrow of Sauron, but there'd be this restlessness. That would what be happen next. He didn't want to write the story because it wasn't very interesting. And Christopher Tolkien reflects that possibly a deep problem was that the story he wanted to tell about Middle-earth, which was from the creation through to the rise of men and the end of the mythological era into the more kind of legendary Arthurian style, the heroes of our legends, as opposed to so very much it kind of verges over into the point where the Homeric period, perhaps, where men take over and then it stops. That's the conception, and that's possibly true. But there's a fascinating bit of evidence that he came back in maybe 1965 and certainly in 1968 to start. In 1968 he wrote another long paragraph, and in 1965 he may well have rediscovered the manuscript and looked at it. These may be the same event. He was thinking in the 60s about it. It was on his mind. He thought there's something worth writing. And the other thing, and that Chris Tolkien observes this, is that basically from 6 pages it's immediately very good. It's very good writing. It's very Tolkienian writing. It's very good writing. And there's an interesting thing to me that it would have been something very different in genre to anything he'd written. One thing for Tolkien, when we look at it, he writes 3 novels. We've got lots of stuff that reflects the Silmarillion style actually in the background, but we don't have much stuff that really reflects he writes some short stories, Leaf by Niggle and things like that, which are great short stories. I highly recommend them. We know his short stories. We know how he wrote a children's adventure novel, which was really aiming, in a sense, also beyond children. We know how he wrote a kind of an England's epic, Britain's epic in Lord of the Rings. The great story, like something between a saga and a novel. And we also know how he wrote his idea of a British or English saga in the Silmarillion. We have those, but we don't have anything which is of a more contemporary vein. And the interesting thing with A New Shadow is that it's a thriller, and it reads like a thriller. And I should say, to start with, it's just nice. We hear it's got a very interesting setup that the tale begins in the days of Eldarion, son of that Elessar, of whom the histories have much to tell. And the story of that time is also heeded now, of the story of Elessar. One of those who did was old Borlas of Penardwyn, who was the younger son of Beregond, the first captain of the guard of Prince Faramir, who had removed with his lord from the city to the Eminanen. So we have the younger son of not Bergil, but Borlas of Beregond, and he's this old man at this point. He's very old, 105 years since the War of the Ring. He's in his earlier hundreds. He's not completely decrepit because he's Númenorian blood. He's got a longer lifespan, and he is talking to a character called Salon, and it starts with this conversation about Borlas thinking about the roots of evil, and then them discussing discussing the nature of evil. This odd philosophical discussion. It starts straight away like that, and then they reflect on the past, and there's this interesting reference, almost certainly to Augustine, where Salon talks about, they talk about Salon as a boy and friends breaking in and playing an orcs game, and being accused, Salon being accused of doing orcs work because they were stealing good fruit and throwing away the fruit rather than using it. And Salon is angry by this, but then he reports that he had been angry about this. And then they begin talking about maybe there are their evil really is rising again. Maybe there is a cult, presumably a Morgoth cult. And then Salon is continuing, like, there's this weird thing, says, maybe you could find out more about it and things like that. And eventually Borlas decides that this will happen, and the story ends pretty much on that Borlas considers what he should do, and he says, I'm not too old to do something. He decides that he will, perhaps I've been preserved so long for this purpose that one should still live hale in mind who remembers what went before the great peace. Scent has a long memory. I think I could still smell the old evil and know it for what it is. And then the story ends in the main typescript with him preparing to leave his house to meet Salon to basically infiltrate this cult meeting, and then he smells the old evil in his house. He knows things wrong. What a place to end it, of all things. And then the extra paragraph is to something along the lines of explaining, well, he lived now with only 2 old servants, and he didn't see his son Berelach. He only saw Salon, his son's old friend. And yes, it's fascinating. It suggests to me instantly the pace of it and the way in which, particularly that ending, the way in which he understands, not that, he meant to end it like that to thrill us, but the way in which he can end paragraph and say suddenly, yes, he knew the scent of the old evil. That he knew there was a pacing thing he had to do, he knew there was an effect, he knew there was this weird, discomforting thing he had to get across. Who is Salon? He says how angry he had been at Borlas. He says he knows about satanic cults. He invites him along in a mocking tone. But what's really going on? Borlas decides to go back out one last time to find out evil and expose it. And yeah, it's not like anything he'd written, but it's immediately compelling. I read it and I thought, much like, and Chris Tolkien says this, that, there really was something of promise there. It was right. If Tolkien didn't feel like it fit his vision of Middle-earth and he couldn't get there, it's completely right, that he didn't want to write it. He was allowed not to. But it's a shame for us, in a sense, because one reads it and thinks, this could have been very good. This could have been and maybe this is the thing, this could have been not a 1,000-pager, but it could have been only as long as The Hobbit, aimed at an adult audience, but only as long as The Hobbit. It could have been Lord of the Rings. It could have been 1,000 pages. But yeah, there's something there for us to imagine and wonder. And certainly I know instantly my theories are Salon is a good guy, and possibly Borlas' son Berelach is not. And I say that the setup, it is very Strider-esque, and it's also the particular story, the particular issue of The Fruit is very much like Augustine in his Confessions. Anyway, I enjoyed it, and it has to be. It's much more of a what if than I thought it would be, because it wasn't here's a tiny fragment, it doesn't really matter. It's interesting he thought about it, but it was immediately compelling. If you've read The New Shadow, tell me what you think in the comments. Tell me your fan theories or whatever on Ceylon and the Satanistic cabal and what could have developed, and Wishcast if you like. I will see you next time.